Hello, welcome to the War Room. I'm here to go over, I hope somewhat briefly, because I have a Zoom meeting in about 40 minutes, the DeGeorge and James essays and my comparison between the two. I first want to start with a question that you might have on your minds. These are two really different, even opposed approaches to the ethics of whistleblowing. What do you do with them? Well, if you were an academic English language philosopher from about the mid-20th century to the end of the 20th century, unfortunately, what you would do is take one side or the other and write endless defenses of that position in a debate between duty ethics and utilitarian ethics, which are sort of the underpinnings of these two positions. I say that's unfortunate because I don't think that added much understanding. What we ended up getting were more and more refined versions of something like DeGeorge's position and something like James's position. I'm not going to do that. And what I'm going to do instead is, well, I refer you back to the course introduction. Remember that I think that our ethical theories are just different ways of thinking about an ethical situation. And what we have here are different ways of pointing things out about an ethical situation, like the Pinto case, which I think is a pretty direct parallel to the case involving the Challenger and the engineers at Morton Thiokol and their role. So I'm going to start with talking about DeGeorge's approach and what he's doing. What I'm going to do is kind of following along with the chart that I posted. It's a comparison of DeGeorge and James. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the underpinnings of their theoretical approaches, because it's kind of, because it's fun for me, for one thing, being a philosopher. But I also want to explain how they're coming out of their positions of duty ethics and utilitarianism, because it's the bedrock. It's how they come to their positions. So I'll start with DeGeorge. DeGeorge is a duty ethics philosopher. And what duty ethics tries to do, generally, when applied to a situation like this, is tries to define ethical responsibility through two things. They want to account for it in terms of a theoretical principle. Ultimately, that theoretical principle, if you remember my intro to Kant, is founded somehow in moral law, which is a law of reason. We're not going to worry about that, but that's where it comes from. It's morality itself. And then secondly, there needs to be a way to define the limits of that duty. So the theoretical principle tells us what our duty is, the content of our duty. And the delimitation tells us, in effect, when we know we've done it. So here's DeGeorge doing that about engineers and their ethical responsibilities. Right. So DeGeorge defines engineers' ethical responsibilities in terms of the promises engineers make. And there are two. One is the engineer's promise to protect public safety. The other is, in this case, the engineer's promise to their employer, Ford Motor Company. That's the duty of loyalty. Right? So he talks about those two duties. They need not, and for Kant, remember, ethical duties should not conflict or compete with each other. Now, because of that, DeGeorge is motivated throughout this essay to show that any apparent conflict is really only apparent what might seem to be a contradiction in the duties, he's going to show a way to avoid. I think it's actually very clever how he does it. So, okay. The principle that explains what an engineer's duties are promises. We promise to be protectors of the public safety, and we promise to be loyal to our employers. That tells us what our duties are. What's the limit? Well, the limit, on one hand, is the job description. The reason I say that is a couple of things that DeGeorge says in his article. One is when, and you may recall this, it's a pretty notable comment he makes in a couple different places. One is where he asks, when the Pinto decision is being made, where were the Ford engineers? And his response is doing what they were supposed to be doing. Right? They were testing the Pinto, writing reports, etc., etc. What does that mean? They were protecting public safety and doing what Ford employed them to do. They were doing their duty, both of their duties. Protecting public safety by testing the Pinto and writing reports that Ford hired them to do. Later on, he asks the question about, well, don't they have a responsibility for the Pinto decision? They reported on the safety to the executives. Don't they have a responsibility when the executives decided to ignore their recommendation? And he said, no, they don't, because they are not paid to do that. That line has offended many students over the years, as though just because you're not paid to do it doesn't mean you're not ethically responsible for it. Well, no. What he's meaning here is it's not part of their job description. They're not part of making the decision to sell the Pinto. They assess the risk, but they're not assuming the risk, either on behalf of the people who buy the car or on behalf of Ford Motor Company. The executives and the consumers are the ones who are assuming the risk. Their duty to the public and to Ford ends when they report on the risks. They have fulfilled their promise. It's very interesting. So we know when they have done their duty because the job description sets the limits for how far they need to go. Why? Because it's the executives who decide how much risk to put before the public, not the engineers. And it's the public who decides to buy a cheap car. It's interesting. It doesn't have to be this way. This is sort of a side note that really would throw a wrench into this. Ford seems to divide up risk assumption, which is making a decision about whether to put a car like the Pinto on the market. They divide it this way. The engineers do nothing but assess the risk. They're not part of decision making about the final product. Only the executives make the decision. They have the call. Engineers advise, executives decide. At General Motors, the decision making is different, and the engineers are part of making a more consensus model of decisions. So if that were the case, the engineers' ethical responsibilities would look very different at GM than they do at Ford. Interesting. But that's not the way it is at Ford. And apparently, the way DeGeorge describes Ford and their delimitation of ethical responsibilities of engineers is the way things were at Morton Thiokol. So this is a pretty direct parallel for our discussion of the Challenger. The other delimitation that DeGeorge, puts on engineers' ethical responsibilities to protect public safety is that they have to design things to the state of the art. If there is a weakness in DeGeorge's argument, I think it's here. DeGeorge says that designing things to the state of the art would mean following National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration standards, which Ford did. But I think that that is not necessarily state of the art. I agree with the principle engineers should follow the state of the art. State of the art meaning for safety design, have the best standards of safety design. National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration standards are never the highest standard. In fact, they are always minimum standards. NHTSA standards for safety of automobiles are minimum standards of safety. So to call them the state of the art would be to say that the engineers' state of the art standards are the minimum standards. And I'm not sure that really qualifies as state of the art. That's an argument for another day. It's not something that we have time to go into. So, okay, sum that up. Duty ethics says that the ethical responsibilities of the engineers is defined by a theoretical principle. In this case, the promises they've made. You have to keep a promise. The promises that they made as engineers are protect the public, be loyal to the company that hires you. Second is that those duties are limited, and the limitations of their duties are their job description. They assess risk, they don't assume it. And the safety standards in place. And remember, they met the NHTSA standards for rear-end collisions in 1968 when the Pinto came out on the market because there weren't any. So that's the DeGeorge approach to whistleblowing. Now, James. James is coming from a utilitarian standpoint. Remember, the general utilitarian idea is that something is ethical if it maximizes overall good or maximizes net aggregate benefit. The ethical responsibility for engineers would then be something like using your engineering skill, protect public in the maximum possible way you can. It's vague. The end point of it is terribly vague. How far can you go? What's the safest possible car you could design? Well, the safest possible car you could design, I suppose, would be one that doesn't move. There's no such thing as a perfectly safe car other than that, right? There's always risk. So the end point, unlike in Kantian ethics, the end point of utilitarian ethics is always somewhat nebulous. That's a virtue as well as a problem in utilitarian ethics because it's an ethical standpoint that encourages us to always try to do more, to always try to create greater good. So, in James's way of looking at engineers' responsibilities, it's kind of hard to tease out because it's embedded in his moral justification, as he calls it, for whistleblowing. So, The reason why whistleblowing is justified, he says, is related to the fact that, first of all, he says, everybody has an ethical obligation to help others avoid harm. It's kind of the flip side of helping maximize overall good. So if I'm riding my bike down the street and I come across a big pothole, by this utilitarian view, if I can warn another cyclist behind me of a big pothole, I have some degree of ethical obligation to call out to the cyclist behind me, hey, look out for this big pothole. How much of an obligation will depend on the circumstances, but I may have some degree of ethical responsibility. So, an engineer has some responsibility like all of us do. Engineers that work in large organizations may seem to have limited responsibility because they only play a small part. Now here James is arguing against the view that DeGeorge has, that an engineer's responsibilities are restricted by their job descriptions. No, James says. Our roles in large organizations may be limited, but because the reach and the impact of large organizations' activities is so broad, our ethical responsibilities, even though our role is small, our ethical responsibilities are broadened too. So, I only teach philosophy at the university. It's all I do. That's not all I do, but it's the main thing that I do. But I'm still somewhat responsible for everything that the university does, in his view, because even if it's something that I'm not connected to directly, the university does it in my name too. I'm a member of it, and so I share in some responsibility for it as a member. Now, as a professional with direct knowledge of the problem, engineers would have even greater responsibility. So there's a difference, say, between a line worker who's just painting the side of the Pinto and an engineer with specific knowledge of the problem with the rear end of the Pinto and the direct result of the collisions being the potential explosions. The line worker has some responsibility for the Pinto exploding too, but not to the same degree, because the engineer's knowledge means that the engineer is in a special position that would allow that engineer more ability to protect the public. Maybe the line worker, because the line worker's been there a while, can kind of sense something's not right. Maybe not. Maybe the line worker overhears something, right? Maybe in those ways the line worker can have some way of knowing something, but the engineer has special knowledge and privilege that puts that person in a particular spot to know and be able to affect a change. And so that person, the engineer's position, comes with greater responsibility to protect public safety, even though their role is small. So that's his position about engineering responsibility generally. If you look at the comparison chart, then, given those theories of what an engineer's responsibilities are, DeGeorge, it's limited, it's very concise, we know when it's done. James, it's open-ended, it seems like it never ends. For DeGeorge, whistleblowing has to be understood in terms of a moral act. Now, remember that there's a duty of loyalty to the company that you work for. Whistleblowing seems to be defined, if you looked it up in a dictionary, as reporting on wrongdoing or potential wrongdoing by an organization you're a member of to the public or to the media. Right? You're reporting outside of the organization, generally. DeGeorge takes that sort of commonplace understanding of whistleblowing. His understanding of it is, that seems like you're violating your loyalty. Wow, well, the Kantian mind says there can't be duties that contradict other duties. So it couldn't be an ethical obligation to be a whistleblower. And in fact, that's what he says. He does toy with the possibility of it being ethically obligatory, but James suggests this in his critique of DeGeorge, and I want to emphasize it. I think if you go through those 5 steps of his criteria, DeGeorge's criteria, if you go through them carefully, it's inconceivable that whistleblowing would ever be morally obligatory. If you go through to the end, you would have to have documentation that would convince an objective party that you were right and the company was wrong. And, this is the 5th criterion, having that documentation, you would be able to know that you would affect a change in the organization's policy. In other words, for the engineers at Ford to be obligatorily blowing the whistle, for them to be morally required to blow the whistle about the Pinto, they would have to have the documentation to prove that they were right about the Pinto. Documentation they did not have and probably could not get. First of all, not without stealing, which would be another moral violation. Secondly, they would have to know that they could objectively prove that they were right. I don't think anyone can know that. Thirdly, they'd have to know that they could convince people that they were right. I don't think anyone can know that. Fourthly, they would have to know that having convinced people, that then Ford would change their minds. That's impossible to know. So it seems to me what DeGeorge is saying is, in effect, if you really go through those steps, whistleblowing is never morally obligatory. Now, when is it permissible? If you look at my chart, for it to be ethical, according to DeGeorge, you got to go through the entire chain of command inside the organization before you go outside. Why? Well, if you go through the entire chain of command, including going to the board of directors, then you've fulfilled your duty of loyalty. How could you have been disloyal to Ford if you've told everybody at Ford, this is the problem I see, and if I don't get any satisfaction, I'm going to go tell the New York Times? You've told everybody that you're going to go call the New York Times. They know you're going to call the New York Times. They're aware of it, and you've told everybody. So it's not disloyal at that point. You've given them every opportunity to change. So that's what he's doing. He's found a way to make the act of whistleblowing not disloyal. So it's not violating the duty of loyalty. Very fascinating, philosophically speaking. So he's met all of his duties. Ultimately, it seems like you're not breaking the promise of secrecy by finally, after all those steps, going to the public. Switch to the utilitarian. None of that stuff is that important to the utilitarian, because what's really important is the end result, the consequence. Do we protect the public? What's the greater overall good here? What is maximum net benefit here? And is loyalty to Ford And is Ford's benefit more important than saving lives? From a duty ethics perspective, the two things, strangely, can't be measured against each other. From a utilitarian perspective, they can and they should. The benefits of saving people's lives seems far more important than the benefits of being loyal to a corporation. At least it does to me. We may debate that, but I think I'll win. Life seems more important than corporations. So, to James, whistleblowing isn't the important thing. In fact, the way he defines whistleblowing shows this. He calls whistleblowing just any reporting of a concern, almost. It can be internal. So to him, whistleblowing is just reporting on something you're concerned about, even within the organization. This is an unlikely and not very common way of defining whistleblowing, by the way. So it's just alerting people. So he uses the metaphor of a referee stopping play in a sport, right? You're just going to try to alert people that something's wrong. Stop play, get it attended to. So for it to be ethical, it has to be effective. It has to actually cause the benefit that you're hoping that it causes, or likely benefit that you're hoping that it causes. That's why he's concerned about the effectiveness of it. So the self-reflective concerns that he has us go through, am I doing it for the right reason? Do I have a vendetta against a terrible boss I've got? Or am I biased in some way? Or it's not because he's so concerned about our, moral goodness. He's concerned about whether the whistleblowing will be effective. If you're biased, you're going to misperceive the information that you've got. If you've got a vendetta, you might be aiming for the wrong guy. So to be effective whistleblowing is to be likely to be beneficial whistleblowing. So aim for the right target and aim for the right outlet. It's always the public's benefit that's the paramount responsibility for James. So, two totally different views. What could the engineers at Morton Thiokol have done? They had literally an 11th hour meeting. I say literally because I think it was 11 p.m. Eastern Time, during which the executives at Morton Thiokol said, we need your blessing on this decision to launch. And the engineers wouldn't give it. Gerald Mason was called out, basically said, can't you control your engineers? Tell them to tell us that it's okay to launch. And the engineers wouldn't tell them that. They insisted that there was going to be a problem. So they told Mason, take off your engineering hat and put on your vice president hat. And evidently he did. At that point, DeGeorge would say, those engineers had fulfilled their duty. Maybe gone way past it because they had gone so far in trying to push internally their claim about this safety issue. From James's perspective, maybe not. Maybe they should have gone further. Maybe they should have called the New York Times right after the meeting. Maybe they should have called CNN that night. But could they have stopped the launch? From James's perspective, I think that is kind of the test of whether the whistleblowing would have been ethical. And we can't know at this point, and they couldn't have known then, would it have been ethically responsible of them to have tried? It's hard to imagine being in the mindset of one of those engineers that night and pondering what to do. It's one of those situations that I'm always grateful that I've never been in. Ethical problems like this happen in professional life. I've been in numerous situations, never anything life and death, but numerous situations where knowing what to do was really this difficult. And probably you will too. And the point of doing these kinds of things, reading these kinds of essays, thinking through these kinds of problems, is really to help you to try to think for yourself, in advance of these things happening. Different ways of thinking about them, different stances to take, different perspectives to look at it. And I think that the Challenger disaster is a terrific one for that, because we'll probably work in large organizations throughout most of our professional careers. I sure have. And that means you're going to come across all kinds of ethical stuff that you'll have to make a decision about one way or another. And in part, it will look like going along or challenging, no pun intended, the situation that's in front of you. And it'll look like something like this. So the next essay puts a totally different spin on the situation of engineering ethics, and it directly is about the Challenger disaster. It's by a huge big shot in the ethics business by a guy named Michael Davis. I think it's actually in some ways really peculiar, but he is an enormous big shot, published several books and something like 250 articles. He's from the University of Michigan, which for a time was the number one philosophy program in the United States. And his primary focus for a lot of years has been on engineering ethics. So he's right on the front lines of this kind of issue.